Welcome, everybody. Can I just remind everybody right from the beginning that this meeting tonight is being webcast for live and subsequent broadcast. You are consenting to being filmed by entering the chamber tonight. When speaking, if you are speaking, please can you make sure that you speak clearly into the microphone, adjust it accordingly, and make sure that it's turned on when you're speaking, so that the red light is on. But when you finish speaking, could you please turn it off? If you don't do that, the volume reduces depending on how many of these things are left on. So please do turn it off. The committee are working on an almost paperless basis. So you'll notice that most members have got, all members have got various forms of electronic device in which they are accessing their papers this evening. Can I ask the committee clerk please to read out the public announcement?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick two brief announcements for everyone present here in the chamber this evening. Firstly, you are welcome to use your mobile electronic devices throughout this meeting. However, if you wish to make or receive a telephone call, we ask that you please leave the chamber to do so. Secondly, we are not expecting a fire drill this evening, so in any event, if a fire alarm does sound, please follow the council officers who will direct you to the mustering point at the Queen's Gardens. I would now like for the members of the committee who will now introduce themselves.
Thank you very much. Councillor Paul Scott, Chair of the Planning Committee.
Good evening. My name is Pete Smith. I'm the Head of Development Management at Croydon.
Councillor Humayun Kabir, Vice Chair of the Committee.
Jason Perry, Councillor for Crome Ward.
Chris White, Coulton East.
Good evening, Jamie Audsley, Councillor in Bensham Manor.
Councillor Joy Prince, Wadden Ward.
Good evening, Ross Gentry, South Area Team Leader in Development Management.
Maggie Mansell, Councillor for Norbury.
Good evening, Councillor Benedict Khan for West Thornton Ward.
Councillor Sue Winborn, Fairfield Ward.
And Councillor Simon Brew for Purley, standing in for Councillor Luke Clancy from Coulsdon West.
Michelle Jerning, Clerk Committee.
And my name's Sean Murphy, I'm the Legal Advisor to the committee.
Thank you very much, everybody. Brings us on to the agenda. The minutes of the last meeting were only distributed a couple of days ago. Personally, I've not had a chance to have a look at them, and I'm going to ask that we defer those to the next meeting so that they can be properly reviewed. Is that okay, everybody? Yeah. Thank you. Apologies. We have Councillor Chowdhury, who is being substituted by Councillor Mansell this evening, and we have Councillor Clancy, who is being substituted by Councillor Brew, and I think we sort of need to maybe he may well be tuning in via the webcast on his honeymoon, I believe. So congratulations to him if he is watching this evening. But please stop now. Let's hope he isn't, but just in case, you never know. Disclosures of interest. Are there any disclosures of interest for items this evening? No. And we have no urgent items of urgent business. But before we move on to item 5, development presentations, Mr. Smith would like to say a few words about the new local plan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just before we start discussion on the pre-app, I just wanted to make members aware, as no doubt you're probably most aware anyway, but the Inspector's report on the emerging plan came out on the 16th of January, and the plan that was considered at the examination in public over the summer, and there were some major modifications to that, but the plan was found to be sound by the Planning Inspectorate, and that was published on our website on the 26th of January. As members will be aware, the plan is going to full council on Tuesday, with recommendations that the plan is adopted. So the point I want to make is that the plan is now at a very advanced stage, and it has significant weight now as an emerging document, and it's recommended for adoption on Tuesday. And if that takes place on that Tuesday, we have a new local plan. So in terms of the pre-app that we've got before us, but also the applications we've got for consideration today, the new plan that's going to full council on Tuesday has a weighty consideration, or it's nearly there. So it's a very important consideration moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete. Okay, so it brings us on to the to item 5.1, the pre-out presentation for Coombe Lodge playing fields. And we have a number of people presenting to us on this one. Mr Gunn-Jones, Ms Campbell, Mr Quinlan and Ms Isles. Could you come forward, please? We also have local councillor Maria Gatland here as well. Maria, do you want to come forward as well? If there's a space. Yes. Okay, we have Mr Gentry wishing to say a few words before the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just thought it was worth just bringing a few things to members' attention before the applicant team present their pre-app. It's fair to say, from an officer's perspective, there's been a very positive engagement from the applicant during the course of the pre-application. The ESFA have acknowledged the importance of this site and they have committed extra funding in terms of the material quality in terms of the scheme itself. As members will see from the committee papers, the scheme has been to place review panel, where it's fair to say it received very positive feedback. Key comments are included within your committee papers at the end. I understand from the applicant that public exhibition took place this week. And officers, as well as obviously the applicant team, are really keen to hear members' views. It's really important that this is not a fixed scheme. There is scope to amend the scheme. The applicant, I believe, is looking at a submission towards the end of March. In terms of the report you'll have seen at the end, it identifies some key areas where we as officers are particularly keen to hear members' views, but of course members don't need to limit their comments to that list. Just to point out, there is a model that's been brought along. If the chair is agreeable, then I suggest that the applicant gives their presentation and then one of their team can talk members through the model itself. If I'd ask, though, that questions are delayed until members sit back down, because it's a public meeting, so that everybody in attendance can hear the questions, if that's okay, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. And so to hand over to the presenting team, you've got up to a quarter of an hour to tell us about your proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening to yourself and members of the committee. My name is Alan Gunn-Jones, and I will chair our presentation. But in reality, you're going to hear from the architects, Sophie and Lee, and also from Anne-Marie in terms of highway transportation and access issues, and then from Peter with regard to landscape architecture. But before I hand over to Sophie, I just really wanted to put very briefly on the table the context for this. This is a journey that we embarked on before Christmas. We've had a series of client engagement meetings which have been very instructive in terms of the finished presentation. We've been before the PRP, we've received their feedback, and we've had a series of pre-application meetings with your highway design and transportation officers. We've met with Sport England, and as Ross has referred to, we had a fairly good public drop-in event last Tuesday, and we're still distilling the responses from that. But tonight's a key step forward. We really want to hear how you view the proposals, and that is another step in the direction of putting a final scheme forward for planning. So, Sophie, over to you.
Thank you. The proposed school will have just over 1,600 students. Its sixth form entry will be 480. Each form, there will be 8 forms per year with 240 pupils in each year group. The sponsors the Folio Education Trust, and there's a distinct specialism of sport on the site. I'm sure you're well aware of the location. As you can see, it's just southeast of the Lloyd Park tram station. There's some information here on the analysis and opportunities. We will dwell on this a little later.
Before Sophie talks about the detail of the proposal, we thought we'd just look at the process so far and the options that were considered during that process, including the super block, the cluster block. We ended up with north-south orientated, what's called finger blocks, actually, with the main classrooms orientated north-south, with south-facing courtyards. So we'd look at a whole raft of options before alighting on option 3. The principles are, with south-facing courtyards, the blue denotes the principal teaching spaces orientated north-south. The communal facilities, if you like, are rendered in orange on this diagram, including the sports pavilion, the main hall, and the refectory. We've organised vehicular access with cars to the east, it's in the top right-hand side, including drop-off. Pedestrian flow principally from the west, from the tram stop, and a small amount of servicing vehicles from the west. Those are the general principles of the school. If we flip back one more key consideration, if we can flip back, if it's possible, was to ensure, next slide please. Okay, so that's lively. Can we?
Left, back.
Back one. That's it. You see the blue dotted lines or dashed lines indicate our idea of permeability, visual connection from the north through to the courtyards to the south. That's been absolutely instrumental in our development of the scheme, and we've held on to that from the start. Next slide. This is our diagram of the organisational concept behind the school and our analysis of how the school is built up that way. And in detail, Sophie?
So the building responds organically with the site levels, both internally and externally. So the first finger to the west of the site is 3 stories, and then to the east is just 2 stories. The configuration of teaching rooms is on a double-stack corridor. So what you see in yellow there are teaching rooms. And then the main spine, which aligns with Coombe Road, deals with circulation and the atypical areas like dining, for instance, on this floor. Next slide. We're on the first floor here, and we have a double-height forum space from the entrance. You can see 2 areas highlighted in red. That's the performance hall, a double-height performance hall, and then the other area is the library. The rest of the fingers are the faculty groups and are the teaching wings. And then finally, the second floor, again, you see the repeat in the plan, and these are a continuation of the generic teaching rooms and science rooms on the middle and east wing. We have 2 buildings on the site. One is the main school, and then the other is the sports pavilion. The sports pavilion is 2 stories. The entrance is centrally, and we have a 5-court sports hall, double height there, with associated spaces like fitness suites and studios and changing areas to the southeast. The next slide is a quick pictorial section of the sports hall, and the slide after this is a long section on the west, taken from the sports hall, cutting all the way through the school, where you can see how we respond to the site levels. And we have the performance space as the first part of the main school building, coming into the forum area, and then the teaching rooms to the right of that.
So in terms of the material idea for the school is that the principle of brickwork is adopted for the main teaching spaces, the classrooms. We have the notion of celebrating in a civic way the larger elements that face north, so the main hall, the art rooms that you see in the middle of the plan of the image on the right-hand side are also celebrated in a kind of autumnal tones. So that's in a ribbed metalwork, as is the sports hall to the left of the main hall. We responded, we think, well to the design review panel's comments about using render on the scheme, which we had at that point. The whole of the scheme now, apart from what you see in autumnal metal, is brick now, and so the courtyards are now in brickwork, which we think is a good positive reaction to that. And some of the elevations, the upper one from Coombe Road, looking south, and then from the playing fields below that, looking north. Some of the sections in development, again, you see, as Sophie described, the reaction to the topography of the site. We think we've been very responsible in that. We're trying to avoid removing material off-site. And then some of the emerging images of the scheme. Interior, the sports hall, the courtyard and the terraces down. And over to Peter for landscape.
Okay, so this shows that the theory you've heard about before made real. So on the east side of the site, on the right-hand side, we have the sports hub and community facilities with the car parking. There's areas we expect to be used in the evening, and then more to the west, but to the front of the site, King Road, we have the school, and behind the school we have courtyards and woodland terraces, and all these areas define a large area to the front of the site, a broad strip with the main access path running through them. And so on to circulation. So the most important asset, we expect most people to come from the west. The main path, through the broad access, the broad strip at the front of the site, we have a large path which grazes the front of the building and provides access to all the main destinations, both to the school and to the community facilities. And then we have a framework of circulation paths behind the school which support the school's internal circulation. Next slide. We have a secure line across. The secure line is mostly formed by the buildings and the football pitch, 3G football pitch, and then which means that we have and then we have a fence around the periphery of the school as well, 2.4 metre high fence. So we have public space at the front of the site, and then it's secure, belongs to the school behind that line. Next slide. We have a hard landscape strategy which has a hierarchy of materials, so most of these sort of more quality materials are concentrated on the front of the site, and then we have lots of different sort of tarmac finishes at the back of the site. We have a sud scheme in the car park, so that's permeable paving. Soft landscape strategy is, so at the front of the site we sort of mirror Lloyd Park, and then we have lots of planting in the courtyards which to create identity and create smaller areas. The habitat around the edges of the site. Next slide. This zooms in on the front of the site, and you can see that path running across it, which is quite an important part of the design in that it's intended to serve both the community facilities and the school equally. So, and you have small reception spaces at each of the main entrances. I think that's it. Next. Onto the courtyards. This is the higher of the courtyards, and it's on 2 levels. So we have workshops spill out onto a high level, and then we have gabion retaining walls in terraces. And the lower part is connected with the school entrance area. There's an atrium sort of complements that, and we have lines of planting and materials and elements leading out into the landscape. And this is the lower courtyard. This is connected in some ways with the dining areas, and we have a 6th form area that spills out into this as well. These provide, both courtyards provide circulation, they're very important social spaces for the school. And at the back of the school we have an amphitheatre for occasional performance, but otherwise just informal sort of socialising. And the terraces are planted so that they also act as screen the back areas of the school from houses on Melville Avenue. I think that's it.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak about transport and highways for a few minutes. We're fortunate through the process to have received data on expressions of interest from families in the local area who want to send their children to the proposed school, and this has helped us to understand catchment area and how that relates to the accessibility of the site. This diagram shows that the majority of pupils will come from these 2 postcode areas, which are CR0 and CR2. It also shows how they're well served by the tram lines in green and bus routes in red and black. This plan shows more detail in relation to specific postcodes, with the site in the middle. And interestingly enough, since this data was received, the school has allocated places for 2018 when it's in the temporary accommodation. And due to the school being oversubscribed in a distance-based admissions policy, all the pupils coming in September will actually be from within 1.2 miles, which is very local and could be considered for walking. But generally speaking, this shows a trend along those tram and bus lines as well for pupils living a little bit further away. In relation to public transport access, it's been mentioned in the officer's report and at several other occasions that the site has a low PTAL. So I thought I'd just pick up on some information available from Transport for London, which shows actually what this means in this location based on the services available for journey times. So the site is shown here, surrounded by red, which is up to 45 minutes journey by public transport, and surrounded by yellow then up to an hour. I suppose in relation to staff travelling, staff would be expected to come from the wider area, and this does show that there is an opportunity for a lot of staff living in Greater London or South Greater London to travel by public transport within typical commuting times for Londoners these days. We've used data from 3 other academy secondary schools in Croydon in order to project how pupils may travel to and from school, and this is the results. It shows, as you would expect from the catchment area and site accessibility, the majority are by walking, tram and bus. I do acknowledge that cycling is shown as 0%. I'd like to pick up on that. There is a historic trend in secondary schools for there to be very low cycling, unfortunately, but it's not the intention that we wouldn't encourage cycling. This is just the baseline, so I'll come on to that in a few minutes. In relation to staff, we've used data from the local area, how people in the Crome ward are currently travelling. Conversely to pupils, it shows that majority of people or staff travelling by car. And again, this is the baseline, and we would encourage, particularly on the basis of what I said about the public transport accessibility and journey times, staff to travel by bus and tram in particular. We've been, we're aware of and we've been advised that there are many other local schools in the area, and this has an impact on travel demand on the network generally. The 2 feeder primary schools are also shown here and here, St Peter's and Park Hill, but there's also 2 other schools, only one shown here actually, apologies, on Melville Avenue close to the school, and Cedars and Royal Russell. The school timetable has been developed in cognizance of the other timetables in the area, and where possible there's a staggering between the start and end of the school day of those facilities in order to try and manage travel on the network as a whole, and also particularly due to the sports emphasis in the school and the extra facilities it will have, there will be a big emphasis on enrichment before and after school. So within the school day itself, pupils will be arriving and departing on a staggered basis. And that helps to smooth travel behaviour in the peaks. So very briefly, we're looking at vehicle travel and peak vehicle travel associated with the school, with our peak hours 7:45 to 8:45 and 3 to 4. The main purpose of this slide was also to show the peak on the network during this time, with the peak generally being in the morning and our peak hour not fully coinciding with that, and the afternoon peak hour of the school not coinciding with the evening peak hour on the network. So again, helping to smooth travel demand. Through the expression of interest data that I mentioned, we've been able to assess how pupils may approach the school on foot, and including how they may approach the school having alighted the tram and bus routes. And this diagram shows that. All appreciate it's a little bit hard to see, but the bus route journeys are shown coming up Melville Avenue and the tram shown in green. The conclusions of this exercise really are that there is going to be a large amount of crossing demand from pedestrians on Coombe Road, and that has influenced our transport strategy. I'll quickly flick through these slides. It's just to acknowledge that based on our site visit observations, what we've been told, and from survey data, that we are aware that there is a heavy traffic volume east and westbound on Coombe Road, and also speeds in excess of the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, and that's also influenced our transport strategy. So really, in our proposals, we're seeking to bring forward improvements that firstly manage or address the impact of current traffic conditions on pedestrian safety, and that's what's shown in this plan here, which is 2 options, 1 and 2, for pedestrian crossing facilities on Coombe Road. This proposal here is a standalone push-button Pelican crossing to the east of Melville Avenue, and otherwise no other changes to traffic movement at Melville Avenue. And this second option is a signalised junction, including the same crossing facility on Coombe Road, but signalising the other arms of this junction as well. And I feel overall the signalised option probably does provide the best safety conditions, not only for pedestrians but for all road users, because it manages traffic demand through the signals. Coming on to the wider strategy, which seeks to address the impact of the school itself on the network. As you may have picked up from the earlier slides, our access arrangements are located to the east on Coombe Road, and they're separated between inbound and outbound. We're also looking at speed reduction features in this area, such as vehicle-activated signage where it flashes if you go over the speed limit, additional warning signage and markings on the carriageway. We also would look at vehicle-activated signage in this location because it does show that coming across that bend, that vehicles do travel at speed. The vehicle accesses are segregated from the pedestrian access and from the Melville Avenue junction to reduce the interaction between those two locations. And we're also looking to extend the footway on Melville Avenue here to connect with the pedestrian access. And then on this side, because there's a lot of pupils alighting the tram, we're looking at improvements in these locations. And just coming back to my earlier point about improving conditions for cyclists, we are considering that at the moment because we acknowledge that that would be of benefit. And some of the things we're considering are advisory cycle lanes on Coombe Road or Crowham Road and other connections. But we need to balance that in relation to the actual conditions on the network and whether that would reduce levels of service. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Okay, thank you. That is all of your time plus some used up, I'm afraid. So hopefully you didn't have anything further very much to add. I thought it was important, given the importance of the highways issues in relation to the school, to give you a bit more time to discuss that as fully as you have. So thank you. Okay, if we can now go and have a quick look at the model. If somebody's able to come over and point us to the right bits, that would be most appreciated. So members of the committee who want to come forward and look at the model, please do. Okay, before we are a bit sickly tonight, so apologies for all the coughs and splutters and things. The officers have asked us as a committee to consider a number of key sort of points. Obviously, we're open to consider anything, but just to sort of quickly just highlight those. So the design of the scheme, the approach to the loss of the playing field area, community use of the school outside of hours, pupil safety and managing traffic movements, car parking levels and encouraging sustainable journeys, and the impact of the development on residential amenities of neighbours and how the scheme might be further developed to minimise any impacts. So as I say, if we could bear those in mind, we're not restricted to those, but I think that's a sort of helpful sort of number of agenda items, if you like, to sort of guide us. Councillor Audley.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, which I enjoyed. I was going to pick up on the kind of community aspect. Obviously, we have Lloyd Park immediately opposite, which has a wide range of facilities, but I didn't really hear any kind of, as I understood it, kind of discussion about the relationship between those existing facilities, the school, whether that could be added. In effect, I guess the broader programming, if appropriate, of that area as a kind of broader community resource. So maybe we could just hear about access to that athletics pitch, relationships with other local groups, etc., that might have come up as the development has been proceeding. Thank you.
Yes, in terms of the community access to the facilities, the sponsor, Folio Trust, are very keen to ensure that the full range of facilities are accessible to the community. So from that perspective, they are at the present time engaged with a number of sports providers, basketball, netball, futsal, football, cricket, and athletics, with a view to ensuring that the sports hall and the associated facilities are in effect almost a facility in their own. In fact, we were in a meeting with Sport England this morning, and they described it as sport first and education second, which is slight sort of, they may well have said that because of the audience, but nevertheless, the important thing is that it is very much a community-orientated and focused facility which will be available to the community, and there is quite a wide range of facilities that will be on offer. And that includes gymnastics, it includes the hall, which you saw, and it includes the sports centre.
Presumably there would be some kind of community engagement plan that would be covered by a condition, so to ensure that, a good level of access is actually provided. Is that the intention?
Yes, I mean, we're looking at the Sport England Community Use Agreement template at the present time, and seeing how that can be adapted to suit this particular concept. But we realise and acknowledge that that will be forming a condition or part of an agreement to secure community access to those facilities.
Presumably that would cover pricing structures and that kind of stuff as well, would it?
Yes, the standard Sport England Community Access Agreement covers a full range of not just pricing, but also hours of operation as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kabir, and then Councillor Perry.
Yeah. Carry on from the community use. Can individuals hire out for a couple of hours for any celebration or any parties if they pay the price? The policy will include that in the community engagement plan?
So I know we've talked about the sports facilities that will be on offer, but there are other areas in the school as well. So there's a large performance hall, which has a capacity of up to 250 on bleacher seating. Within that area, we also have music recital rooms. We have a community ICT suite. There are areas inside of the main hall building which have a secure line, which also are intended for community use of varying sizes, so up to 250 in that main performance hall, as well as when you look at the sports pavilion, there's a cafe area in there and smaller, more functional rooms as well. So there is a wide breadth of activity dedicated for community use outside of school hours.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Perry.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's in my ward of Crome, so I know the site well, and I've got a few things I'd like to cover off. The first one is the siting of the actual school buildings themselves. Clearly, it's a large site. We've seen that. We've seen the model, etc. And yet, the buildings are sort of seem to be situated right behind the residential properties of Melville Avenue. And I just wondered, one of the points we're being asked here is about the residential amenity. And I just wondered whether it had been looked at, those buildings being directly behind the houses of Melville Avenue. In theory, it could have been switched around so the actual main school buildings were slightly up the hill further. So I just wondered why they'd ended up where they were. I guess my first point. And on the transport situation, a sort of a very rosy picture, I think, has been shown of the local transport situation. And you've rightly run through, there's lots of schools already there, Old Palace, Rutherford, Cedars, Royal Russell. Quest, which is on the other side of the hill, didn't get mentioned. And Quest are large users of the tram system. So I'm slightly concerned that that didn't seem to factor into what you went through. And the transport links, I think most people would say they're pretty poor, other than the tram. And the buses run at the other end of Melville Avenue, which is a fair walk away, and they're not that well served. So I just query the sort of transport situation. And at peak times, when all of those schools are arriving and leaving, the tram system is pretty much full now. So I wonder how the tram will cope with this additional number of pupils, particularly when you feel that a vast majority will be going onto the trams. Because at the moment, those trams are full up with Royal Russell, with Quest, etc. So I do have concerns about the viability of everyone getting onto those trams. I've then got issues around the road. I don't know if you want me to break this up a bit or keep going? Yeah. So with regard to the road itself, obviously Coombe Road, very busy, very dangerous, and the junction at Melville Avenue is a very dangerous one. Obviously, you showed a couple of options there. I think I'm slightly concerned that with the idea of the pedestrian crossing being virtually on the corner of Melville Avenue, it seems to me to be bringing lots of things together in one point, and then using signals to try and control it. And I would have thought pushing that crossing further up the hill would have been more beneficial and would be safer for pupils accessing the school. It seems to me that we're bringing everybody to a point on the corner of Melville Avenue, which I think is a concern. On parking, we're being asked to consider the parking, and I think at the moment there's a large car park, and that seems to be correct. And I think some of the pointers here are saying, pointing to sustainable journeys. And I think the local transport situation being as it is, I think the car park does need to be large. And I think to reduce the car park, I think would be the wrong thing to do. And I think, seeing 66% of staff will be parking, using cars, etc. There is no on-street capacity currently. It's already full. So I think the car park should stay where it is. But there's no mention of drop-off or, is there going to be the ability to drive in, drop off, drive out? So we're actually taking that traffic out of Coombe Lane, because that wasn't mentioned at all this evening. My final point was about service vehicles in Melville Avenue, and I just wonder whether that's appropriate. Again, we've got a crossing, we've got a busy junction that's dangerous, and then we're looking to put service vehicles sort of in the same place as well. Would it be better if service vehicles came off Coombe Road rather than Melville Avenue?
If I could just, Sophie will deal with citing, and then Anne-Marie will pick up those transport-related points. So perhaps Sophie first.
I was going to hand the site actually over to Lee, but if we could have the master plan up on the screen, it might be quite helpful when we're talking through the site. Is that possible?
I think we could
don't worry otherwise.
We can answer it without the drawing, I think. In that we can answer it without the drawing, I think. We looked at a host of options in terms of the siting of the building, and the particular concern was to move the car park as far away as possible from Melville Avenue, from that junction. So the key move was pushing the car park to the east as far as we could, and also to site what will be a noisy, the noisy element of the 4G football pitch with its floodlighting as well, away from the neighbours on Melville. So on balance, we felt that the way we'd organised that was right for the site. Pushing the building further into the site as the site rises up, there's a massive level distance from north to south, something like 20 metres. It's colossal. 28 metres, there you go. It's very high. And the more that we push the building to the south, the more we have to dig out. And we felt also, on top of that, that for the school to be positive and have a good presence on Coombe Road was the right thing to do. So when we put all that together in the design process, we thought we'd hit the right balance with the scheme as we see it.
I think the remaining questions were about transport, which I'm going to answer now. You mentioned transport links in the area being poor, about Quest Academy, about the tram in particular, a lot happening on Coombe Road, parking and also the drop-off. So I'll come to each of those in turn. I think we're aware of the transport constraints in the area. As I mentioned, we'd been out to site and visited and seen in particular the traffic volumes on Coombe Road and also the speeds, and that's evident through our surveys. What I didn't say in the presentation is that we've also been in receipt of data from Transport for London for both tram and bus. And we've put together a very detailed assessment which is currently with TfL for review at the moment. And that showed that actually not on the immediate approach to Lloyd Park tram stop, but in other locations there could be an impact on the tram. I think that's because of what you were saying about other schools such as Quest Academy, which I didn't show on the plan admittedly. I was more concerned about the schools in the more immediate area. But in relation to the tram, and published online is TfL's strategy, which they've investigated through detailed feasibility for expanding the tram network in the future, in the lifetime that the school will be expanding on this site if permission was to be gained. And that shows that the intention is for the Lloyd tram, so the Lloyd Park branch, or the branch that is served by Lloyd Park, would be increasing in the peak hours from currently 7 or 8 trams an hour both directions to 12 trams an hour both directions. So as I said, our assessments are with TfL at the moment, but we understand that they do have intentions to expand the tram network, and likewise our data is with TfL buses as well. So we'll be reporting on that as part of the application. We'll also be meeting TfL before the application, and that information will be available, and we'll be able to report on that, hopefully positively, when we come back to committee for a decision. So that's the tram. In relation to Coombe Road being busy and dangerous, and everything happening in the one place in relation to Melville Avenue, the pedestrian safety and the location of the crossing, we did actually consider moving the crossing facility further up to the west, or sorry, to the east, as you suggested. What that shows is that it brings the crossing off the pedestrian desire line, so you could get an issue with safety where some pupils just decide to go across the junction at Melville Avenue anyway and unfortunately put themselves at risk. It also shows in relation to traffic congestion that the queues associated with the crossing, while it's a red light and pedestrians are crossing, would be exactly the same in either location. And as I said in the presentation, we do feel that the signal controlled option does allow the crossing to be provided on the desire line and manage the traffic in that location in a way that's safe for everybody. But all our proposals will be subject to a stage 1 road safety audit as part of the planning application, and will be assessed by an independent auditor. So again, that information will be available through the planning application. I think the next point was about parking. We have based our assessment about parking needs and the level of parking on the demand generated by staff associated with the 66%, as you mentioned. And apologies for not mentioning about drop-off, but it is intended to allow some managed drop-off to occur within the site, not at a level that it would be unmanaged, so that it wouldn't undermine the projections that have been made about sustainable transport, about walking, hopefully cycling in the future, and use of the bus and the tram, but that it would be on a needs basis, through perhaps a permit system that parents perhaps with pupils with mobility impairments or other needs, or who live at further distances for whatever reason and have no other choice, they're not accessible to bus and tram, could apply for a permit. So in that way it won't be unmanaged access to a drop-off, it'll be managed access to a drop-off, and therefore not undermining the sustainability of the school. The car park is also going to be used by visitors to the sports, which could include coaches. We haven't provided coach parking because it wouldn't be used all of the time. So some of the parking would be set aside for coaches, and therefore the rest of the car park would then be available for visitors. So that's just a flavour for the parking proposals. And finally, about service vehicles, yes, it is acknowledged that we're going to propose continuing use of Melville Avenue, but just to advise members that that would be a gated facility only for servicing. So for delivery vehicles and refuse collections, we've been fortunate to receive data from the trust that's going to operate the school based on their other facilities, which suggests that the deliveries might be 5, 6, 7 deliveries a day. And most of those would be by small vehicles. So therefore, I would hope that members would feel that that wouldn't have a significant impact on residents. The largest vehicles would be a refuse collection, and it's my understanding that the Trust would have a privately managed service, so they can actually control the timing of that, and that would be during the day, again, minimising the impact during peak times. So I hope that answers all your questions, and let me know if it doesn't.
Okay, if we could sort of focus on highways issues for now. If I have questions on highways issues, Councillor Gatlin, I can't bring you in now, but I can bring you in at the end. But you can raise any points you want at the end, okay? So is anybody wishing to raise particularly highways matters? So Councillor Prince and Councillor Brew. And I'll bring the others in a minute.
Yes, I started to think about my issue as a highways matter, but it's wider than that, but you'll see. You said in the presentation that your baseline of mode of travel for pupils, that cycling was vanishingly small. You would want to come back to that, and you said just now that you would hope that hopefully cycling would be an increasingly used mode as time goes by. Given that the school is going to have a sports focus, this seems to be, a bit too hands-off to me. If you're about a sports focus, cycling is a sport to a lot of people. We have concerns, as does the whole country, about childhood obesity and just general fitness levels. And I would have thought, I would have hoped to see at this point a much more proactive plan for making cycling a big part of the pupil experience, which would then be reflected in the design of the school. So I would like to hear more about that, please. And, of course, it would have to include safety, and thereby we come back to the highways aspects.
And could I just, on that point about cycling, because I think is a really important point, is there not provision, whilst it might not be a very good road for cycling, but there is a very wide footpath and very wide verge on the other side of the road, which could double up, I think may well even double up already, as a cycleway as well as a footway, which would actually come up to where the crossing is and allow the encouragement of a significant amount of cycling, I would have thought, because actually, unlike Councillor Perry, I'm rather concerned about the amount of parking. I mean, we've seen, I think I'll probably average at the moment for schools, secondary schools, the amount of parking spaces I get is about 4. So have 130 seems incredibly high, given that whilst this doesn't have a particularly great PTAL rating, it is very close to the rest of the town. And so I'm concerned about that. And one way of actually addressing that surely would be by putting in cycling infrastructure and encouraging cycling, as Councillor Prince says, to a sports focused school.
I'll answer these 2 points. Yes, the data, the baseline is based on historic trends from other schools. So unfortunately, that does show 0%. We looked at 3 schools, and 2 were 0% and 1 was 0.5%. And I know the Quest Academy, which has been mentioned already, their cycling demand has fluctuated between 0 and 1% in the last number of years. Definitely cycling fits with the sports ethos of the school. The discussions with the Trust on Tuesday at the public consultation about how much they want to emphasise walking in particular, but also cycling, because it does fit with what they're trying to do. And it's not the case that we haven't considered cycling at all. We are looking at what could be done in order to provide cyclists with facilities. just let me talk about Coombe Road, because that is the primary approach to the site. Because it is 6 to 7 metres in width, the footways are generally about 2 metres, consistent on both sides of the carriageway, although immediately north of the site that footpath is a little larger than 2 metres. The carriageway can't be widened. We've got the constraint of the tram, and we've also got the constraint of property boundaries, and likewise the footways can't be widened for the same reason. A shared footway cycle facility should be more than 2 metres. And because of the high pedestrian demand expected, it'd be very, very difficult to provide those segregated facilities without changing the nature of Coombe Road substantially. And we don't feel that that would be acceptable to highway officers, considering the significant or prominence of the route in the area. So what we can do, I'll stop at what we can't, and I'll talk about what we can do. In TfL's London Cycle Design Guidance, they talk about advisory cycle lanes, which are marked on the carriageway in conditions where they're not only for cyclists. Vehicles can enter the lane, but it does show where cyclists would travel. So you could provide those on Coombe Road, and equally you could connect Coombe Road with areas to the north that are within a reasonable cycle distance, perhaps through off-road facilities in the park. And you could also provide a recommended route connecting the Coombe Road, perhaps on Castlemaine Avenue or one of the quieter residential streets, not Melville Avenue because it's got the old Palace schools, and then provide similar facilities on Crowham Road, again connecting with pupils living to the southwest. So just to rest assured that we are looking at cycling, we haven't forgotten about it, and we will be bringing forward proposals as part of the application. To pick up on the point about parking, I agree that we shouldn't undermine sustainable transport by providing too much parking. I think the primary reason for the parking levels being set at the level they are is to take cognizance of feedback we've received at public consultation about residents concerned about drop-off or staff parking in their streets. There is very limited parking at the moment. The only residential streets that can be used for those purposes are Melville Avenue and several other streets to the west. And even notwithstanding the high expected mode share by public transport and other modes, there is still going to be a number of drop-offs, and we feel that it would be preferable for that to occur within the site where it can be managed, as opposed to on residential streets where it cannot be managed. So what we're trying to do here is strike a balance, and I hope that you'll be interested to see the cycling proposals that come forward in due course.
Well, I think we definitely would want to see some strong cycling proposals come forward. I mean, we have an appalling level of cycling at the moment in this borough. To say that that's the case and hence we'll follow that is obviously not going to be acceptable. And we would want, I'm sure, to see less parking if not being parking provision on the site. Local residents always say they want loads of parking on school sites. It doesn't mean you should concrete over huge chunks of what are currently playing fields to provide that amount of parking. It does seem rather excessive at the moment. And I think a provision from within this scheme, financial or whatever, to help support cycling and cycling routes, whether they be through the park or enhancement of the footpath if that's possible, and whatever measures can actually be put in should be expected, frankly. Particularly given if we've got all of the students coming from within 1.2 miles, that's 20 minutes walk maximum. To not have that kind of provision provided for in terms of whether they're cycling or walking would be wrong, I think. And equally, it sends out all the wrong messages if all of the teachers who want to drive can just drive. We've got very busy, very congested streets now. Let's not make them worse in terms of lots and lots of teachers driving to and from the school. Okay, Councillor Brew.
Thank you, Chair. I was concerned about the comment about managed versus unmanaged access of drop-off. It seems to me if you say we're going to have managed access only, and that is by driving into the school from Coombe Road, dropping off and going out again, and that's going to be restricted by permit or something, that's simply going to result, it seems to me, in those who don't have the permits, dropping off simply by stopping on the road in Coombe Road. And in any case, anybody who's coming by car to drop off along Melville Avenue is certainly not going to come to Melville Avenue, turn right, go into the school, drop off and go back again. They're clearly going to drop off in Melville Avenue itself. I think that needs better thought, perhaps, than has been, than I have heard so far today. Some of my other points were covered, but there's one I would make. I admire the desire for cycling, but coming from the east, it's a pretty steep hill up there. The average person, maybe a fit sports student might be all right, but most people might struggle to get up that hill to the east. So I would be cautious about assuming too much cycling is accessible from the east. In the other directions, it's fine, but I'm just worried about the east. Thank you.
Should I just comment on particularly the drop-off point there was particularly important?
Yes, I acknowledge the point in relation to managed versus unmanaged access to the car parking. I think that given the conditions on Coombe Road, it would be very, very difficult for anybody to stop there. In an eastbound direction in the morning, traffic is slow moving, but nonetheless solid. And in a westbound direction, it's free-flowing but stopping at various junctions, and the converse would be true in the morning and afternoon. So in theory, although it could happen, I think in practice it would be very, very difficult to. I certainly, as a driver and somebody who parks, wouldn't seek to do that. But the car park management plan is currently under development, and we can look at how the permit system is devised in order to ensure that there is some management flexibility, perhaps. The point about vehicles travelling up Melville Avenue and that it wouldn't make sense for them to go around the school, again, I acknowledge, but equally Melville Avenue is already incredibly busy in the morning and afternoon with the Old Palace schools, and I think once drivers coming to the school get to know the area, they're unlikely to choose that route for various reasons. Also, through the data that we've received from the school, it shows that people coming from a much wider area are probably more likely to be travelling on either eastbound or westbound from Coombe Road, most likely eastbound. And then finally, in relation to cycling, we have noticed the change in topography on Coombe Road on the eastbound section, but actually those pupils who are more likely to cycle, I did have a plan with postcodes, would be within the 2 kilometre, 3 kilometre, 4 kilometre radius, and most of those pupils are living to the west and the north of the site. So if we were going to be providing cycle facilities, it would be to cater for those users. So I hope that answers those questions.
Thank you. Councillor Wright.
Thanks, Chairman. Just to underline what members have already been saying regarding the highways, such like, I find it very, very worrying that another 1,600 pupils are going to be put into the mix at a time, and we all know that Coombe Road is already chock-a-block most of the time, that type of time, and we know that the tram is already overloaded. And I wonder, I appreciate you've done an awful lot of modelling already, but I wonder if perhaps it need to go back again and have another model. 1,680 or whatever it is, pupils coming in various ways, whether it's by tram or by car or by whatever, or by bike or something. It needs to be looked at, I think, in more detail, because it is a problem, a real problem there. Other points, Mr. Chairman, if I may. We've got it mentions the flood risk zone 1, and I see the report says it can be dealt with by SUDS, and I just wonder how effective that will be. Having previous experience of SUDS, that they don't always work to expect. And you just say that the development achieves better than greenfield runoff. I find that difficult to believe. So it really needs consideration, because if that is going to be a problem, then Melville Avenue are going to suffer. And that is something which I don't know whether they do now, but it could be a problem. Sports England obviously have had a big input in what you've been thing. I'm a little bit disappointed when they suggested cricket, and you immediately just dismissed that virtually as saying we're not considering it. I mean, for Sports England to ask you to do something and then to dismiss it seems to be a bit over the top. Here we are. But my main point, Mr. Chairman, is the site of nature conservation, which is mentioned at the southern end. Could I ask how that is being managed? Are we going to enclose it and board it off, or we're going to keep it as part of the whole site so that pupils can use it as a part of the curriculum, or whatever? If it is going to be just left, then there's a real danger that they just seem to get into scrub. So I think you need to perhaps address something like London Wildlife, or someone needs to be taken into account to whether they can manage it for the school, because it is a big area. Because the report just mentioned that the whole site is a habitat for breeding, and that is another problem which I think you're going to have to look at before we start, is how you're going to relocate some of the birds and the bats or whatever, and that is a very big problem and needs to be very seriously considered. Well, that's my main points, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to address those?
Yeah, if we could perhaps come back on 3 points. One, Sport England and cricket. The discussions this morning at that meeting, we did table a proposal which indicated how cricket could be accommodated within the range of playing facilities that we have proposed. So from that perspective, we're fairly confident that there can be a cricket facility that sort of carries on and is available. So that I think deals with that point. In terms of SUDs and drainage, the greenfield, the loss of the greenfield is obviously a critical thing in terms of the contribution that makes to flows. But we're also talking about a site that is in places poorly drained at the present time. So the part of the work associated with laying out the athletics track will result in better drainage and better servicing. So there will be a concomitant improvement in the ability of the greenfield area that's retained to absorb surface water. And I'll ask Peter, if I may, to just respond on the last point, which is to do with the sort of nature conservation side.
Well, I'll try. But the sink site is the woodland, which is an extension of Coombe, which runs to the south of the site. And the intention is to, in a way, it's sort of unfortunately, is that we have to secure the site, and so we have a fence which will run along the boundary to the woodland. I'm not aware, and perhaps I missed something, of any particular ecological interest within the site boundary. And we have a shelter belt of trees, but actually in the site itself, we're outside the sink area. And it's a playing field. It has immediacy grass. We have a few areas that are planted with trees, the vast majority of which we keep. But the sink is on the boundaries. I don't know. Should I cover that?
I could come back quickly. Just woods are woods, yes, but they do need to be managed. And it's very, very important that they are managed continuously. And perhaps you made an idea to talk to our conservation and nature conservation officers, because they can probably advise. Because if the woods are just left, they soon disintegrate.
Just note that, or
we'll note that. Yeah, the wood is outside the bound. The main part of the wood is outside the boundary. But yes, of course, yeah, we will take advice from the ecologist on future management.
Okay, thank you.
I think if we just we just need to bear in mind that the activities on the site as well, and we're talking about the artificial sort of grass pitch and floodlights and those issues, could potentially affect the ecological and nature conservation value of neighbouring sites, and that's, I think, where that point is leading the report in terms of understanding the impact of the development on. And of course, nature moves, and it makes use of playing fields as well. They're not just contained within the woodland necessarily.
Okay, thank you. Can I see which other members wish to speak? Councillor Mansell, Councillor Wimborne.
Yes, thank you. It's It's a big school, a lot of children. It's very good that it is a sports focus because that's a healthy activity. But the number of children who are going to get sports, make a living out of sports is probably relatively small. So it's important that they have the full range of the curriculum, and I'm sure that's included. And obviously sports science is a big part of that, and it's a way of delivering basic science with a focus on sports. But it worries me a little bit that we've got the laboratory up on the right-hand side of the diagrams, and we've got the deliveries coming in on the left-hand side. And science teaching does require quite a lot of deliveries coming and going, and I would have thought that rather than have all those chemicals and machines and whatever else you need to teach science these days, I learnt science a long time ago. All those things coming through the school doesn't seem sensible to me. You know, and I wonder if you shouldn't have the science laboratories closer to the deliveries area. It's absolutely right to have the deliveries separate from the children's coming and going.
So the service yard functions very closely to the kitchen and the dining area. So that's where we anticipate the largest number of deliveries for. We also have provided a lift. I see what you're saying, that it's on the third floor on the east side of the building, but we have, in all honesty, all of the faculties will have distribution requirements. So the main part will come from the service yard, and then we have the general store will then take the distribution throughout the school as and where required. But we place the dining area and kitchen there in the location that I think you're talking about.
Yeah, the laboratories will need their own stores.
Yes, they do have their own stores.
Yes.
So we have a very large science prep area, which will dissipate all of the chemical distribution or the equipment accordingly. And there's, I think, 130 square metres for prep for that,
I think
for that reason.
This is a health and safety issue, and we've discussed it at length with the school, and they're happy with that means of transport of materials to the labs.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wimborne?
Thank you, Chairman. Like others, I'm very concerned about drop-off and pick-up issues. I was in Melville Avenue this morning. There was no space whatsoever. Castlemaine Avenue was just the same. And I would imagine it's the same every day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, can't see anybody else from the committee wishing to say anything further. I'll just pick up a few points myself. I think in terms, nobody's mentioned the design of the scheme, which I think we can take that as a very big positive, not as a slight on the architects or the landscape architects. It does look like a very well-considered scheme. There's a lot of interest in there as well in terms of the different blocks and what those are doing and how they work with the layout of the school. It's really good to see the landscape design, including elements such as the amphitheatre, for example, and how those sort of difference in levels be used positively to create a really interesting environment. The use of the school out of hours is really important to get that right. So often we hear this talked about, and it doesn't seem to materialise in the way that people would have wished. So I think we'd be very keen to see that that is actually delivered properly. There's already been a lot of comments on pupil safety and managing crossing the road, getting to the site. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, though, that 1.2 miles is the biggest distance any student's coming from. Walking to the site ought to be a major part of the transport strategy here for pupils. Frankly, if they're all having to pile on for such a short distance onto the tram to be able to get to a sports specialism school, I worry about how effective the sports specialism is going to be. You know, they really ought to be encouraged to walk a relatively short distance or cycle and not necessarily use the public transport that's there. And you know, inevitably some will, but let's hope that that doesn't that is managed properly. We haven't heard much, though, about the impact on the amenities of residential neighbours. And I'd be interested to know what is the distance between the proposed school buildings and the sort of active external areas to the rear of the neighbouring properties. Is that something that could be, could the school realistically be moved further away, or what is the distance, and what other mitigation are you looking to put in to reduce particularly noise impact on neighbours that will have had the experience of having virtually no noise coming from the immediate sports field for much of the time? Obviously there's the road and that kind of thing, and now have a large school there. How will that sort of noise impact be mitigated? And then I'll ask the local councillor to come in and make her comments.
I don't have the exact distance, but I think it's in a range of between 20 and 25 metres from the closest property on the southwest corner.
Is that to the boundary or to the house?
To the boundary.
To the boundary.
To the boundary. So we're talking from this point to the fence line of the nearest property within that range. In terms of the noise, the finger scheme operates quite effectively in creating these courtyards, but it also creates an acoustic buffer. So we anticipate that the dining area, which is in this location, has a covered courtyard here, and within that area, external dining or play will happen in either of those courtyards. And I think the building itself will create a buffer for noise to exit, and it will certainly help that issue that you're talking about.
I think that the courtyards will serve to contain noise as well, and with no noise on the western side of the westernmost finger, there should be no pupil noise there, actually. And it's lower, yeah.
And will there be a sort of a planting buffer zone or anything like that, so that you don't got lots of pupils deciding to stand right next to the fence and make lots of noise?
Yeah, yes, there will be. In fact, at the earlier point, I forgot to mention that the edges of the site will all be developed as habitat areas for ecology. So you have a zone of 10 metres or so all the way around at the edge of the site, which will be left as meadow. But in some areas, especially where there may be some impact on residents of Melville Avenue, we'll have planting. We'll supplement the planting there. It'll take a little time to get going, but eventually there'll be sort of an area of woodland on the boundary.
Okay, we might well...
and particularly in the service yard, yeah. And that's also near the courtyard, which is closest to residential areas. And it's a point that the courtyard's much lower. They're 2 or 3 metres lower, as well as the building enveloping them on 3 sides. On the open side, they're not really that open because the landscape terraces upwards.
Well, I think where that's good to hear that there'll be this landscape buffer where we are closer to neighbours and where trees are being planted. Obviously, if those could be more substantial trees when they go in, rather than a series of whips that will take forever to turn into anything substantial, that would be, I think, very beneficial. Particularly as obviously the corner and the sort of splayed sort of section of the back gardens there in particular, I think something that is able to establish quickly. I can't see any reason why that couldn't be planted early as well, actually, in the development of the building. So that maybe there's 1 or 2 growing seasons already happened by the time the school has opened. Would be, I'm sure, very, very beneficial and appreciated by local neighbours. Okay, thank you. Councillor Gatland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, a lot of the issues have already been covered by the committee, particularly by my colleague, Councillor Perry, but also, I think, by Councillor Scott, as one of my issues was the impact on residents. And I would like to see, certainly coming forward in the planning application, is a detailed landscaping plan so that we could see a plan that would actually help with the noise. There is going to be noise to residents. There's no doubt about that, and particularly with the community use and the long hours use. We want to see community use, but equally we don't want the residents to be too much impacted, and I think landscaping can play a big part in this. In what residents have contacted me about, and indeed what I've spoken about at the consultation, is, of course, the traffic plan. I don't think that it's fully realised because although you say, Councillor Scott, that the children live near the school, this is for the temporary school. Children would live nearer. But as we know, even when children live near the school, parents will drive to the school because, of course, they have their lives to lead and they have a busy life and they need to get to their work or to their other commitments. And I think it's quite clear that parking is an issue. We do need that car park. And from what I remember from the consultation was that once the car park was established, perhaps some of the construction or service vehicles would go through that way rather than through Melville Avenue. So I'd like that clarified if possible. As I say, I think there needs to be a lot more work on the traffic plan. There are going to be a lot of children in the mix at commuter hours coming through the tram eventually for the permanent school. And children's safety, getting to school and getting back from school safely is a key issue. And that really needs to be one of the top concerns, as well as the impact, I think, on residential amenity, particularly around parking. I mean, Councillor Winborne was quite right. You cannot find... I was calling into a resident in Melville Avenue the other day. I was actually going by car. I could find no parking at all in the middle of the day for Melville Avenue or indeed in Castlemaine Avenue. So I think there are difficulties that really do need to be looked at. I wonder if you could clarify that the former proposal around the one-way system in Melville is completely off the board now, because that's important for residents. And also you mentioned, I think, some traffic changes or improvements around where you get off the tram. Coming up to the pedestrian crossing. I think you mentioned that. Perhaps you could enlarge on that. And could you also, the entrance further up, which would be the entrance to the permanent school, you mentioned traffic improvements, I think, there, as well on Coombe Road. Could you clarify those? And is there anything around road widening there? Because residents mentioned that they had some concerns about road widening there and any impact on Lloyd Park and on that old avenue of trees that run along there, which is quite famous as the avenue in Lloyd Park. So I wonder if you could answer those questions. Thank you.
I think most of the questions were for myself, so I'll start with those, and if we miss out on any. You mentioned about parents driving, notwithstanding the distances. I think just even thinking about the fact there's already 2 feeder schools in the area, and anybody driving or already driving. Some of those traffic movements would already be on the network if they are generated by the school. But it's definitely a case, I feel it's definitely the case due to the site accessibility that the majority would walk or use public transport, and that is evident at other schools with a similar PTAL. The one I'd like to highlight is Quest Academy, which has similar access to the tram and also has 2 bus routes. Actually, it's only 1 public bus route. There's another school route. So it is very, very similar. In our slides, I showed the mode share for the school with 12% travelling by car. Quest Academy actually have 8% travelling by car. So it just goes to show that schools with those type of facilities nearby do generate journeys by sustainable travel rather than the car. And we haven't forgotten about the car. We have included it in our assessments, and we have included the on-site drop-off to ensure that doesn't take place on Melville Avenue. I acknowledge the point by yourself and your colleague about not being able to park on Melville Avenue. We have done parking surveys and we've seen that, and I spoke to residents on Tuesday who explained that to me. So the on-site drop-off really is there in order to mitigate that. I appreciate your comments in relation to the proposals needing more development, and certainly they are in the process of being developed. Pedestrian safety is paramount in the proposals, and hence our explanation for the two types of crossing facility that are being considered, and our preference for the signalised junction, because it does help to manage safety for all road users. So I hope that, although needing more development and needing road safety audit, would allay concerns in relation to pedestrian safety. You asked specifically about pedestrian improvements near Lloyd Park. That's to pick up on the extra demand coming from the tram. So I can't use my pointer here. Oh, actually I can. In this location. So the access to the Lloyd Park sports facility we're investigating, and also the Northern Footway in that location. Improvements there are in relation to the access to the tram, are likely to be some form of pedestrian crossing improvement, and along the footway it more likely be an environmental improvement if, for example, the surfacing of the footway needed improvement. As I mentioned before in answering other questions, unfortunately due to the constraints of the tram, it's very difficult to widen facilities or create new pedestrian facilities in that location, so I hope that provides sufficient explanation. You mentioned residents asking you about road widening on Coombe Road and what we were doing about Coombe Road. We are proposing an inbound and separate outbound vehicle access, and we're aware of the speed issue. So the improvements in relation to the network are more to try and calm speeds passing those accesses. But in order to create the accesses, and particularly to allow the turning movement of coaches, which could be used in relation to access to the sports facilities by visiting schools, the turning circles are quite wide, so that does mean that some widening is required. We're currently in the process of getting a survey of the location of the trees in that area, and we want to try and minimise the loss of trees because we acknowledge that they are very high quality, and we will seek to do that. The nature of the road, the landscaping in that area, it is heavily tree-lined, and I think wherever we place the access arrangements will unfortunately involve some loss of trees. But as I said, we're looking to minimise it, and we would also seek to mitigate through replacement planting. I think that one way on Melville Avenue was considered as part of the application for the temporary application. I understand there was two options being proposed, a one-way northbound and then no change in traffic circulation, and they're to be brought forward as part of a traffic regulation order proposal. It was our view, and it's also officers' view, that a permanent one-way northbound wouldn't be acceptable, so that won't be coming forward as part of our proposals. Forgive me, I can't remember. The current proposal is for servicing to be retained by Melville Avenue, not to move across at the moment. I should also have said in relation to servicing that the school will have a delivery and servicing management plan, which will mean that all deliveries are met and the gates are opened and they're scheduled. So I hope that would help residents in relation to that activity being managed.
Okay, thank you. A couple of quick things that I've just thought of and should have mentioned earlier on. The point about traffic calming further up the road, I think anything that can be done to calm traffic as it comes down. At the moment, I'm slightly worried that you've got road widening proposed near where the car park entrance and exits are. I think we actually want anything that can be done to physically slow down the traffic. Would be very positive there. And I appreciate it can't be speed humps or whatever, but if it's sort of some kind of rumble strips or whatever. Personally, I don't not that keen on the things that flash the speed and that kind of stuff, because once people realise they've gone through at an excessive speed and haven't got a ticket, they ignore them from then on. So which is why typically they're only used short term in different places. So that's not going to be, I think, part of the solution here. We need actual physical measures that are actually going to calm the traffic as it comes down. There is a speed camera already further up, which demonstrates the need for having that speed control there. And personally, I think the idea of a signalised junction would certainly, as you suggested already, as your preference, would be the best thing on that junction, rather than having a junction that sort of relies on some drivers slowing down for crossing anybody actually, but crossing pupils in particular. Whereas actually, an actual red light, you must stop now, seems to be the most suitable and appropriate kind of junction. That carries more enforcement, if you like, carries more weight. The car park, and we've heard more about the car park and the importance of it. I think making the argument for the size of that car park is important. Personally, as I say, I think 130 sounds a lot, but clearly it needs to be a big car park relative to what we would normally expect to see. But if it wasn't 130, that would be good. But let's make sure we get the right sort of level there. And one final last thing, the views that you showed us in the presentation this evening were all the school side of the hedge, and it would be really useful to have some views of what the school will look like from the road side of the hedge and from the park, because that's the most important sort of view. Once you're actually in the school, you're going to see lots of school, but actually the views from the landscape, from the big park, which is a very important part for the borough, I think are really important. So some views of that would be very helpful, I think, in giving us the real impression of what you see here. And so I've got a couple of more hands coming up. Councillor Perry, do you want to come in quickly, and Councillor Audsley?
Thank you. It's just on this road widening issue that has sort of latterly come up, and I think any road widening, if there is any proposed or planned, it's really got to come from this site and not from Lloyd Park or Coombe Lane. And if you go into Street View, the trees are all on the Lloyd Park side of the road. And then if you go a bit further up, you go into the walled area, and it's very much comes back down to a country lane. I think to start interfering with any of that element would be a very backward step. So I think it's really this site that needs to contribute to any road widening and nothing else. And just quickly coming back on the car park, I think the car park is very important because it will help to relieve those flows. And I think with this being a sport college, a sports school, visiting coaches, visiting minibuses, school teams, school plays, parents' evenings, the car park will be stuffed beyond belief anyway at the size that's being proposed at the moment. So I think to reduce it at all would be a backward step as well.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Councillor Audsley doesn't know. I want to ask a further point. A lot said there, a lot to take on board. Not very much said about the architecture. I think we're all happy with the way that the school is looking and working. At one point on the health and safety, Councillor Mansell raised. Obviously, you need to be looking at that and make sure that that is working health and safety-wise. The siting of the building, I think there's a sort of general sort of feeling that you've got the right sort of approach there. There's lots of, there could be lots of questions about it going elsewhere, but I think the fact that you've got this big rising slope, actually settling it down at a lower level seems to make a lot more sense. Whilst this isn't going to be green belt anymore, it's still, obviously, it's an area in between two areas of green belt, so actually having a modest building, that's sort of much as it can be a modest building, which is a big school, sitting down into the landscape is important. Getting the transport right, getting the access to this school, whether you're on foot, which hopefully lots of people will be, whether you're on bike, which equally hopefully lots of people will be, or if you're having to drive or on tram or whatever, getting that right is going to be the absolute key to getting this school working well for the future and actually not impacting negatively on the wider area. So I think we will be looking very carefully at that once the application comes back to us. Equally, any mitigation measures, such as we've discussed around reducing the impact on the neighbours, will be important. And whilst I don't think the actual words were mentioned around construction management plan, that will also be something that I think will be important in terms of making sure that the site development has as limited an impact on the neighbours as is possible. Is be really important. Hopefully, I've sort of summed up the sort of key sort of points there, but obviously there's a lot for you to go away and take on board. We look forward to seeing the application come forward in the near future. Thank you very much. Okay. We better move on quickly before planning committee start to die off. It's a distinct possibility, the way it's sounding at the moment. We have the one item before us for decision this evening. No, that's okay. That's okay. Which is item 6.1, land to the rear of 16 Highfield Hill. And the presenting officer on this is Toby Gethin. Toby, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for the short delay there, just setting up the laptop. So this is item 6.1. The site is at land to the rear of 16 Highfield Hill. The proposal is for 2 new buildings on the site, providing 1 4-bedroom detached house and 4 2-bedroom flats. The site is located in the ward of South Norwood. It sits to the north of 16 Highfield Hill and to the west of Hamlin Gardens. Hamlin Gardens, you can see here with the cursor, hopefully. Apologies, you can't. Hamlin Gardens is just to the top of the star on the satellite image there. That was built, it's a new development of houses that was built about in the last 10 or so years. The site is accessed via an existing track off Highfield Hill and also a path that splits off from that track and carries on down to College Green. The vehicular track goes through the site and carries on and serves number 16 C and D Highfield Hill. The site is currently open scrubland with a large number of trees on it, and it's surrounded also by, within and around the site are 3 preserved trees. As you can see from the satellite image here, there's a lot of tree coverage around. So moving on to images of a few images of the site. From top left and going clockwise, you see the track and the path beside number 16. This is taken from Highfield Hill, from the road itself. And then we move into the site, the top right image. Move into the site, you've got 16 Highfield Hill just to your right, and you can see the site stretching out before you with Hamlin Gardens to your right. If we then go to the bottom right image, you're now at the other end of the site, looking back towards the properties, the rear of the properties on Highfield Hill, with Hamlin Gardens on your left. And then the final image, bottom left, is taken from the rear of Hamlin Gardens, so the rear gardens there, looking at the subject site itself. The new detached dwelling house would be to your left, and the block of flats, the floor flats, would be to your right and kind of broadly towards where the photo is looking there. So moving on to the floor plans and the block plan. The block plan is top left. The detached house floor plans are to the right, and the flats floor plans are on the bottom left. All of the proposed residential units would comply or exceed with the minimum space standards, and each unit would have a parking space, cycle storage and sufficient refuse storage. Being dual or triple aspect, all of the units would receive sufficient natural daylight, sunlight and also natural ventilation. The house would have a private rear garden for use by occupiers of that dwelling, whilst the flats would have 2 large communal amenity areas to the left and right of the block of flats there. Although some pruning of trees would be required as part of the scheme, the 3 preserved trees would be retained as part of the development. Tree protection measures would also be secured by condition and be part of the development to ensure that the trees that are retained and are pruned are done so in a kind of an appropriate manner. So moving on, we have the front and rear elevations of the proposed buildings. As you can see, they would have a fairly modern appearance, but they would come across in a kind of townhouse type, modern townhouse manner. They'd be built out of cream or light-coloured brick with natural slates for the roof. Officers considered that the proposal would have an acceptable mass design and overall appearance, and would respect and not appear out of character with the surrounding area. So next, and I think my penultimate slide, we have the side elevations and sections giving you a bit of the context of the site and its location to neighbouring properties. Although separation distances to Hamlin Gardens are slightly less than the common standard or the common practice of 18 to 21 metres in terms of privacy and overlooking, officers consider that the proposal would not harm neighbours' living conditions to the point that the proposal should be refused. The reasons for this are the separation distance of generally minimum of 16 metres is sufficient to avoid a significant amount of overlooking. You then also have a difference in land levels, existing and proposed landscaping, and also boundary treatment that would all serve to reduce the direct harm that might arise. There are also, obviously, a large number of trees on the site. As I said, these would be retained, so that will provide further kind of screening between existing properties and the new properties. And finally, there are some sheds or kind of small outbuildings in the rear of particularly the Hamlin Gardens properties, which again provides a bit of a buffer between the proposed and the existing dwellings in the area. So finally, to conclude, officers' recommendation is to grant planning permission subject to the conditions listed in the committee report. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Questions for clarification? I've got one. As the report states, planning consent was previously agreed on this site for 2 houses. I think you may have up your sleeve somewhere a rather faint drawing showing what was actually approved previously. Could we have a look at that? Because I think that's a rather important consideration.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So apologies, it is rather faint. This was granted in 2000, so almost 20 years ago now, scarily enough. So that means we don't have electronic copies, so we've had to do a scanned version, which hasn't come out particularly well. But I wanted to include this in case this sort of question arose. As Councillor Scott says in my officer report, the site does have a lapsed permission from 2000, which is for 2 buildings of in a similar location on the site, albeit at different angles to the current proposals.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? No? Councillor Brew?
Yes, please. I note you say the distances are a little less than optimum in terms of overlooking and so on. Are there any windows that are actually overlooking either each other within the site or overlooking neighbours in either direction?
Yes, thank you. So I'll just get this image back up to its largest size. So in terms of windows overlooking each other, I suspect the next image will be well, the side elevations I've shown for some reason. Here we go. The side elevations on the left image there. There are some windows between, in the middle of the site between the 2 buildings. So the windows on the flats do look towards the house and vice versa. However, for the dwelling, the detached house, the windows there generally serve bathroom or hallway, or I think a double aspect bedroom. So actually the overlooking between the 2 buildings officers are content with and don't feel that there's going to cause an issue. And then if I move to the rear elevation, there are indeed a number of windows on the rear elevations of the proposed buildings that would look towards the properties in Hamlin's Gardens. At ground floor level, particularly with the small projection for the flats, that separation distance is about 13 metres. I think I referred to that in my report. 13, yep. But due to land levels and existing boundary treatment, there won't actually be any overlooking because the proposed buildings are much lower than Hamlin's Gardens. So in terms of the main separation distance, it's between the first floor of the proposed buildings and the ground floor and upper floors of Hamlin Gardens. And that's why I've referred to 16 metres. I think it's about 16.3, 16.4 approximately as the minimum. And then as the properties slightly separate as you go across the site, it turns to something about 17 metres.
And sorry, I'm eating a locket here. Picking up on the same sort of point, the windows to the rear of the block of flats, given that on the first floor level you've got a large sort of living, dining, kitchen room, Is it proposed that those back windows would be obscured, or would they be high-level windows, or whatever, given that you've got a lot of outlook from the other sides anyway? And I also note that on the top floor, that the windows look, they're either Velux windows in the roof slope, or they're dormer windows looking the other way.
So taking that last point first, or that last question first, yes, on the in the roof, you would have roof lights to the rear, essentially looking towards Hamlin Gardens, but their roof lights clearly limit the amount of overlooking you get from them. And to the front, mainly to avoid any extra overlooking, you've got the dormers, so you've got more light and more outlook for the new occupiers, but not overlooking to neighbouring properties. And then returning to your first question, in terms of the first floor, the flats, I think there are 12 windows to the rear on the first floor. The original proposal, or the as-submitted proposal, had those windows as full-height windows without louvres. Following neighbours' concerns through the objections we received, the agent submitted some amends, and that now has reduced the height of those windows. They're not quite full height, which will reduce some of the overlooking, and half of those windows would have louvres on them as well. So whilst they would still get some light in and provide a bit of outlook, the amount of overlooking has been reduced. The windows the rooms served by those windows, if I can spit my words out, also have windows on the flank elevations of the building too. So those rooms don't rely solely on looking towards Hamlin Gardens.
Okay, thank you very much. No further questions. We have two people wishing to address us. With me, we have Mr. Avery, who is an objector, and Mr. Swain, who is the applicant's agent, I believe. So if those gentlemen would like to make their way down, please. Okay, gentlemen, you both have up to 3 minutes to tell us your particular perspective on this application. Starting with Mr. Avery, please, when you're ready.
I represent the residents of Hamlin Gardens and Highfield Hill who object to the proposed plans. We overlook the site and are all directly affected. Thank you for addressing our initial objections and appreciate the changes made in response, including reducing the height of some of the windows. However, these do not adequately address our concerns. While we acknowledge that something may be built on the site at some point, the current plans are not appropriate. The boundary issue. We are very concerned that the red line boundary is inaccurate and contradicts our own land registry deeds, which we have submitted to the Council following the developer's response to initial objections. Over development. The Planning Officer's report made mention of the accepted plans in 2000. We agree that the historic plans for two two-storey houses of 6.5 metres in height is probably not overdevelopment. However, the current plan for two three-storey buildings, 5 properties in total, with 10 metres of height is. The development sees a 50% increase in both the height and the footprint from the previous plans. These plans were also accepted before Hamlin Gardens was built. With 5 properties on the site and the parking provision of 1 space per property, it is insufficient and does not take visitors into consideration. This will increase the parking burden on Highfield Hill, a road which is already congested with residents parking and the nearby primary school. The access point to the development is narrow and shared by pedestrians and vehicles. There is a significant safety issue as the adjoining alleyway links Highfield Hill with primary school nearby and a playground in Westow Park, and is a popular cut-through for children and young families. A delivery van unable to turn around in the development and reversing onto the road would be blind to pedestrians on the existing footpath. Privacy. The report states that 18 to 21 metres distance outlined as in the Mayor's Housing SPG is a yardstick for visual privacy, and so the proposed distances are acceptable. However, this document also states that designers should avoid windows facing each other where privacy distances are tight. Some aspects of the buildings are only 13 metres from our houses, and windows facing our main living areas are as close as 16 metres from the first floor of the development. Our gardens are significantly closer and even more overlooked. This is not a currently densely populated area, so we see no justification for the relaxing of these parameters. There is also no allowance for a screening of any sort that might help improve privacy. The planting of smaller trees that grow around 5–7 metres might create some screening. The developer's tree report seems vague, and we want to ensure the integrity of the large protected trees on the site. It states maintain clearance would be advised to provide, say 3 metres of clearance above the footprint. This leaves the option open once construction is underway to remove branches should they wish to do so. It does not state how much pruning will be required. 1, 2, 3 metres? The health of the tree cannot be established without knowing this. In addition, the report states for any proportion of tree removal, new tree planting will be integrated into a landscape scheme. They plan to remove at least 1 tree from the site, and it was entirely green with mature trees and bushes until March 2015, when it was cleared.
Thank you. I'm afraid your time is up. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, Mr. Swain, you have up to 3 minutes to tell us about your application. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The proposal has been developed through detailed consultation with Croydon all the way through 2017. The proposal provides much-needed residential accommodation with 5 high-quality dwellings in this vacant and underused land. The high-quality design that we've come up with, which is of a contemporary nature, using high-quality and durable materials, respects the character of the local area and is considered to be appropriate for the immediate neighbourhood. The scheme does not harm the amenity of the adjoining occupiers, as is detailed in the officer's report. However, taking on board the comments that have been made tonight by my colleague next to me, we could introduce some further screening onto the boundaries. There is a landscaping condition which is proposed in the officer's report. We will be pleased to provide some additional visual screening there if necessary. In addition to that, the first floor windows could be enhanced with privacy screening further than what we've shown so far. We felt that the measures that we've provided were sufficient, but noting that that is a key concern to the neighbours, I'd be happy to take that further. The highway safety issues are really addressed in our transport assessment, and has been looked at by the council's officers, and everybody is happy that what we're proposing is acceptable, and the level of car parking and cycle parking which is proposed is adequate for this very modest development of just 5 dwellings. Going on to the tree report, we had a specialist arboricultural consultant come up with the report. There is measures which need to be undertaken during the course of construction, which will be under the supervision of that arboricultural consultant. And I think that there was a condition being proposed for further details of the tree works going forward as well. On the issue of the boundary, I'm a little perplexed by this because we've done an overlay of the land registry title, both of ours and of the neighbouring development, and they appear to correlate with the drawings that we have. The location of the trees was obtained from a measured survey that was undertaken by a specialist land surveyor. So I'm a little confused as to why we have this situation. Nevertheless, if the trees are slightly in the wrong position and are slightly further to the east, as perhaps has been suggested, then this brings them further away from our development and actually means that there will be even less impact on them than the very minimal impact that is caused at the moment. Overall, again, I would just like to really highlight that we've developed this sympathetic design quite carefully through close consultation with Croydon, and really we feel that it should be supported.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Swain. That's your 3 minutes up. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Okay, do officers have anything further they wish to add? Can I just ask a question, actually, raised there by the applicant around the potential to increase the level of screening and increase the level of obscuring to the first floor windows to the flats, I think was what was being referred to. Is that something that we could do within the scope of this application?
Thank you, Chair. I think certainly in terms of potential landscaping, boundary treatment, that sort of thing, it's something that could be secured. Maybe we could increase the wording in the condition, but it's something that could be secured through condition. I'd possibly defer to Pete Smith on whether we could do anything further with the windows as part of this application. I suppose my slight hesitation about including much more screening there is that, that there's the potential that residents in the new flats could start to have quite limited light and that sort of thing. So I guess there needs to be a balance between the two that needs to be thought about.
Can I just check that before Mr Smith comes in on that one? My understanding, looking at the plans, is that the first floor of the flats is one big room, essentially, or most of it is one big room, living, dining, kitchen area, which has got windows on 3 sides. So even if they had obscured glazing at the back, they'd have light coming in, but you still have views on the 2 other sides, which would be more than most people get from typically window in one wall.
Indeed, yeah.
And in terms of, this committee has, is able to impose conditions that it considers reasonable. Clearly, issues of privacy is a material planning consideration, and it's something that's of importance to residents. So it's absolutely correct if members want to impose conditions making overlooking more restrictive, as long as they're satisfied, as you've said, Chair, that the accommodation is still of a reasonable standard for future residents.
Okay then, thank you. Opening to the committee. I was going to come in, I'll bring myself in first and then I'll bring in Councillor Perry, just because I wanted to continue the point that I sort of raised there as a question to start with. I think the scheme is very well designed. I think it's an attractive sort of modern design. There is, and also there's obviously clearly the precedent for consent for building in those locations. The main trees would be protected. There's a reasonable level of parking provision provided, etc. I think the one issue for me is the overlooking distances between the upper levels of the flats and the houses behind, because they're quite. The houses behind in Hamlin Close have got quite small gardens. There's obviously a relatively small gap, probably about 4 or 5 metres to the boundary. But actually, the first floor flat rooms, actually, as I mentioned earlier on, have windows on 3 sides, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that those should be obscured to the rear, and you still have the windows on the 2 other sides of that room, which still be very nice, and they're still generous, large windows. That would avoid the overlooking that the residents are concerned about, because there isn't any window directly looking out from the roof level, where they've got those upper floor flats have got they're like sort of maisonettes, but they've got their main windows looking out the other side. And indeed, on the ground floor, as I understand the sections, and correct me if I'm wrong, the units, because of the change in ground level, they just sort of look out into the embankment, and so they can't really look out into the neighbouring gardens or the neighbouring properties. So I think with that change, I think this scheme would be acceptable. It would mitigate the impact on the neighbours quite significantly from what's proposed at the moment, making it an acceptable scheme, I believe. So I'm sorry to jump in straight away, but on that basis I'm going to move the officer's recommendation for approval. Councillor Perry.
Thank you, Chairman. On a similar vein to yourself, but I come to a slightly different conclusion. The objectors obviously raised issues around overlooking privacy, etc. The applicant seems happy to make further changes to the scheme. I'm a bit concerned that what we condition may not actually be what the objectors were thinking. So personally, I would actually move that we defer this so that the 2 parties can come together and discuss. There seems to be a common ground somewhere there. I would defer it that so that the parties can discuss this further and make those changes for themselves rather than we impose it with condition. So I move that we defer this for that discussion to take place.
And if, with such a deferral, it may well be that if agreement could actually be reached, that we wouldn't need to bring it back to committee. So could we leave that to the officer's decision as to whether or not this needs to come back for further consideration here?
I think if the parties are agreed on those mitigations, then yes, I don't see why it would need to come back.
Mr. Smith?
To generate further thought around this, I'm also conscious about windows opening. And clearly obscure glazing is fine, but if windows can be opened, or whether there's issues around debating a restriction or a restrictive opening so that ventilation can move, but overlooking is still limited. That might be something also that one might need to consider as part of this debate.
I'm happy to withdraw my motion for approval and to second the motion for deferral to look at this improved screening, also taking into consideration matters such as Mr Smith has just raised there in terms of ventilation, so that an acceptable relationship is actually developed. Do I see anybody else wishing to speak on this one? Councillor Wright.
Could I just suggest one thing, Mr Chairman, if we are consider permeable material? Permeable material. It's not in the conditions I think it should be in this particular site.
Is that permeable materials for the hard standing areas?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Is that something that's... is that covered within the scope, or is that something we need to spell out?
Well, there is a SUDS condition that's recommended on, and SUDS will deal, intrinsically with permeable. I mean, the area that we will need to focus on is the car parking and how permeable that car park is. So that will be captured as part of that, but Mr Gethin might be able to.
Thanks. So, yeah, just to expand on that briefly, SUDS condition would cover permeability of the site. The development also proposes for the parking area permeable sail web type foundations is the wrong word, but sail web coverage for the parking areas, which means that they would be permeable already. And the landscaping condition that we would include in any permission that we grant also requires hard landscaping to be permeable where appropriate. So absolutely, we would be expecting permeable materials.
Is there a time limit to do all this? I think there should be a time frame.
I can hopefully satisfy a committee that next week, and I'm sure the applicant will be very keen to move this forward, and we can maybe maintain contact with Mr Avery, or I would hope that the applicant will do that, and we can progress matters quickly. We're not here to slow development down. We wanted to make sure it is working sustainably. Thank you.
Could I just suggest, I mean, obviously, as part of the suggestion earlier on was also the windows, but also if there could be a strengthening of the landscaping as well, with the small trees that I think the objectors mentioned as well, something that isn't going to, we don't want to, I'm sure they wouldn't want to roll our landai along there, but some modest woodland trees could actually help break that up as well.
Chair, if I could just suggest, yes, the landscaping is a condition. I would suggest that we don't go into detail at this stage on that level of landscaping, but we put an informative on a planning permission, which will clarify what the debate has been around the landscaping, and that can then be captured as part of the condition discharge.
Okay. I don't see anybody else. Are we happy to agree the motion for deferral in terms of those improvements? Please.
Chair, just to clarify, I think from a legal perspective what's been proposed isn't so much a deferral but a delegation back to the officers to determine the application once they're satisfied on agreement having been reached between the parties as discussed.
Subject to that agreement between the partners within a reasonable. I mean,
I think it's understood what was being said. It's just to clarify the technical language around it.
Fine, thank you. Is everybody happy on that? Can I see those in favour? So
10 in favour.
So that is unanimous, and hopefully, gentlemen sitting in front of me here, you'll be able to come up with an appropriate solution between yourselves, working with the officers to actually mitigate the concerns or most of the concerns that the neighbours have actually raised. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, that brings this meeting to a close. I suggest we have a 5-minute recess, and then we'll start the subcommittee at 9:05. Okay, thank you.